Well, welcome to, let me see here, day 83 in our journey through the Word. Again, more interesting reading in today's reading, but we learn how the sin of just one man impacts a whole nation and ultimately impacts the man and his family. Today we're introduced to Achan. Achan means disaster. I wondered as I looked at the meaning of his name, what you know, what would it be like to know that your name meant disaster? What would it mean like as an adult knowing that the meaning of your name meant disaster? And we see today that's exactly what Achan brought on to the people of Israel and to his own family. His sin began with his eyes. He saw these fine things as Eve saw the fineness of the fruit on the tree that had been forbidden by God. He chose not to resist. He could have, but he chose not to resist. What began in his heart became that would be a curse upon he and his family. He looked upon these things, or had he looked upon these things with eyes of faith, he would have seen that they were cursed by God, and he would have dreaded them. But instead, he looked upon them with lust. He coveted them at the beauty of the items, what they would provide for he and his family in the future as far as things, as prosperity. How would anybody know? Who would know where they came from once he decided to use them? But instead, he looked upon them as goodly things, not godly things, but goodly things, things that were pleasing to his eyes, pleasing to his senses of the future, trying to make sense of those. But when he had committed the sin, he immediately had to hide it. He knew the commandment of God, and yet he took it anyway, and he had to hide it. And where did he hide it? He hid it underneath his home, the place where his family lived and dwelled every day. That's where he hid his sin. As soon as he'd gotten his plunder, it became his burden. So different do objects of temptation appear at a distance to what they do when they have been gotten. So different do they look when they're so far away, but when we have them in our hands, how different are those items of temptation? In his case, he knew he had to hide it because it was wrong. What about those things in your life that have been such a temptation, and instead of turning from that, calling upon the name of the Lord for his help, that you've reached out and taken a hold of that temptation? And how different has that been? Whether it's been money, position, sex, any of those, and the list can go on and on, look so beautiful from a distance. But the curse, the penalty, the price to be paid is great. We see in this case, and we know in our own lives, the deceitfulness of sin. That which is pleasing in the commission is bitter in the reflection. The bitterness of sin after we've already committed. Sin is very troublesome, not only to the sinner himself, but to those around him. And we saw that in today. When Achan had committed the sin, he tried to hide it. As soon as he had gotten the plunder, it became his burden. So why is it that when we follow God's leadership, At the first sign, we try to quickly question his plan. Yeah, Achan tried to, he knew that was wrong. And we saw today in the reading that he was quick to say that, yes, that I had done this. And because of that, the price was, it cost him his life, but not only the life of himself, but the life of his whole family. Paid the price for his sin. But leading up to that, we saw where the Israelites went out to fight, that they were defeated. And men died because of one man's sin. I also had to wonder in today's reading, why is it that when we follow God's leadership, at the first sign of defeat, we quickly question God's plan? We saw that in the defeat of Israel in battle and the death of man. Joshua quickly turns to God and questions his plan. Why are we quick to question God and slow to look at ourselves, at our sins? I found it interesting that Joshua just fell before the ark. And it doesn't say he spoke until the end of the day. He just laid there before the Father in the presence of God himself. It was the sin against God that caused defeat and death. However, once the sin was purged, once Achan and his family and all his possessions were destroyed, God tells Joshua, do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. We see deception on account of Achan, and we see the same type of deception on Israel by the Gibeonites. And I don't know if I said that right or not, but I'm going to give it my best shot. Deception means to mislead by a false appearance. And we saw that in today's reading, where the Gibeonites men deceived the leaders of Israel by saying that they were from a faraway place when they were really close by. And the sad thing is the Israelite men, the leaders, took the word of strangers, people they didn't even know. They took their word without seeking insight from God. How many times have I jumped in with both feet, thinking that I could discern without seeking God's counsel? That's exactly what they did. And so it made me wonder, how often do I do that? How often have I jumped without asking God first? Sadly, I would say far too often. And I ask you the same question today. How often have you jumped? Have you taken the word of somebody that you didn't know? Have you believed something, and yet you haven't stopped to seek God's counsel in that? My takeaway from today is I am not able to discern the truth without God. I must trust Him, and I must never trust in myself alone. Because when I do, I will always fail. Great words of wisdom from today's reading. I hope you will take them and put them deep within your heart. And when faced with those challenges, stop, fall before the Father, and seek His counsel. Ask Him, what is it that I need to know? What is it I need to do? I hope you have a great day, and I will see you again tomorrow as we continue our journey through the Word.